From years of anxiety to warrior and mentor, Bradley Robinson created the Anxiety Project to help you end your anxiety naturally. Let's mold the new you and let's end anxiety together.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Anxiety Project podcast. Welcome to episode 291, where we're diving into the collective mind, the hive mind today. And we're talking about how one's self can separate from this collective and become self-actualized and become an individual rather than another mouthpiece, rather than another puppet to the ideas of culture. Because I've noticed within my own recovery from anxiety and agoraphobia and my own addictions that through this self actualization of how I was a slave to my own internal desires, I was worshiping these internal desires as gods, as a god, as many gods, putting them and realizing this, it opened my eyes to not just my own personal desires, but also the desires culture is inflicting and subjecting me to, and how that culture's narrative is such a strong pull, and how culture wants me to maintain an unconscious way so that I can keep on consuming and consuming and consuming without having any thoughts of my own. Because it was Jung that says people don't have ideas have people. Jung also says the further we go back into history, the more we see personality disappearing beneath the wrappings of collectivity. And if we go right back to primitive psychology, we find absolutely no trace of the concept of an individual. Instead, we find only collective relationship. And so this is called participation mystique, an organ in relationship to the body, or of a part in relation to the whole. That's what Eric Neuman says in his book, The Origins and History of Consciousness. And Eric Neuman was a student of Jung. And I love this book. It's one of my favorite books of all time, The Origins and History of Consciousness. And so Eric Neuman goes on to say that the ego can only free itself very slowly from the tyranny of the group. Think about that. The ego can only free itself very slowly from the tyranny of the group. There is a lot to unpack in this book, but he also says there is a late birth of the ego, consciousness, and the individual. So think about it when you're young, right? How it's just part of our development to join in a group, in high school, in elementary school, we become a part of something. If you don't have any friends, if you feel like an outlier in school, then you know, right? If you were one of those people, you know how extremely distressing it is. You feel like you're not accepted and you get depressed. And so being a part of a collective is just the way it is growing up. It's growing up. You when you're young, you fit yourself into a group of kids under the umbrella of society's narrative, cultural influence. And so a normalcy grows within culture, a normalcy. What's normal? What's normal? What's the narrative? And as an example of this, I grew up with this narrative from culture of how meat, eggs, saturated fat was deemed very, very unhealthy. And now, it took me a long time, took me many years to actually dig my way out of that idea, out of that narrative, because I started to read other books. I started to tap into other people's experiences and new studies that were coming out to unravel this narrative I just grew up with. Eric Neuman also goes on to say that the individual has not yet broken loose from the emotional undercurrent, and any excitation of one part of the group can affect the whole, as a fever seizes upon all parts of the organism. So it's our instinctive human nature to be accepted within the group, for we are pack animals. That makes sense. To be an outlier is to be rejected, is to be alone, doomed to only rely on oneself in a complex world. We can't function in a world with just our brain, because what the heck do you know? The world is way too complicated. The amount of times I've gone to Maggie with an idea in my head, with a viewpoint that I've been circling, and I say it out loud to her. And even when I say it, I realize, oh yeah, there's a lot of holes. There's a lot of flaws in this. Maybe there's another way I can view it. And then when she gives me her opinion, I'm like, man, I can't believe I've been holding on to that. Or man, she's right. There is that other way to look at it. It's a complicated world, okay? And we need other people to help us sort through the complexities, the ideas that are circling within our own minds. And so there's this amazing book that I want to dive into called Ordinary Men. It's by Christopher R. Browning. One of my favorite books of all time, because it's about how these ordinary policemen in Nazi Germany come to kill thousands of Jewish men, women, children, pregnant women. This is a great book psychologically because it depicts how one can get sucked into this collective narrative. And it's this struggle between the morality of the state and the morality within your own soul, within you. And there's this one part in the book where this major, his name is TAPP, and he's feeling a lot of distress. He says, "Oh God, why did I have to be given these orders?" And then another policeman witnessed TAPP pacing back and forth, mumbling and saying, "Man, such jobs don't suit me. But orders are orders." Another man remembered vividly how TAPP finally, alone in a room, sat on a stool and he wept bitterly. And so as TAPP complained about his orders, his men proceeded to carry out the battalion's task. They're shooting all day countless amounts of Jewish people. So the ideas possessed the people of Germany. But many of the policemen struggled with this conflict of morals. The state is asking of this. This is the vision of the state, but I feel sick. I feel sick. This isn't right. The conflict of the state morals and the conflict of the internal morals at the same time. Eric Neuman says the passivity of the individual in relation to the herd is to some extent a condition of the herd's activity. When consciousness is insufficiently differentiated from the unconscious and the ego from the group members find themselves as much at the mercy of the group reactions as of unconscious constellations. Because he is pre-conscious and pre-individual leads him to experience and react to the world in a way that is more collective than individual. How much hell and how much blood do we need to shed in order to open our eyes to the bad ideas plaguing our culture? It's like King Theoden in Lord of the Rings, the Two Towers, where he's this literally paralyzed, lifeless blob on a throne. Wormtail or Wormtongue. I get these guys confused because of Harry Potter, Wormtail, Wormtongue, but really they're the same people. You know, he's whispering into the king's ear, and he's being possessed by this idea, dark, malevolent ideas. And it's this power hungry side of the psyche, right? That's Wormtongue, the power hungry side. So imagine a person feeling aimless, anxious. There's no meaning in their life. And they are now a part of a group with responsibility, and they're being acknowledged by the state. They are being rewarded by the state. They're granted power. They're granted some sort of power to carry out orders, like the policemen in Ordinary Men, right? Ordinary people being lured into this responsibility. And also note that these policemen, they weren't forced into these orders. Their sergeant told them, hey, you can leave at any point if you want to. That's what's so fascinating. You can leave. It's not like they're forced. When you're feeling aimless and you have this bitterness about life in general, you want to be a part of something, but also the state and the culture will lure you in with some sort of status, right? You will be acknowledged. You will be praised for being a good comrade. It's like in Canada during the COVID-19 lockdowns, you were encouraged by the state to inform on your neighbors if they were engaging in like a Christmas dinner. I remember that. It's absolutely despicable. You were encouraged to inform, and it became illegal to have a gathering with more than a certain amount of people. So people were looking out for other neighbors that had more than a few cars in their driveway that were getting together. And people, one third of the population was compliant and happy to engage in such a thing. And still is. So that feeling of acceptance will certainly be there for those people who just wanting to be accepted. They want to find some meaning, and it's very attractive. Or think about it this way: you're in a position already. You're in a high status position, and the fear of not complying, well, and losing that position is quite potent. Right? You don't want to lose that. You're biting your tongue. Jordan Peterson talks a lot about that with his colleagues in the therapeutic industry. He saw many of his colleagues bite their tongue. They didn't want to speak up to what's going on in the world because they're afraid that they'd lose their jobs. So they're willing to suppress the feeling of this isn't right, refusing to generate any personal thought on the matter, and letting culture's ideas possess them instead. And so why pathological ideas are so attractive to people is the power element of them, that you can capitalize on those dark motivations and you will be rewarded for it. Feeling bitter and unfulfilled in your life, oppressed maybe, it's because of this other group of people. It's because of this other group. So join us, be a part of the group, be a part of this group. And that we see this division more so in our culture today than ever. What a division. Eric Neuman says, the more unconscious the whole of a man's personality is, and the more germinal his ego, the more his experience of the whole will be projected upon the group. The more unindividualized people are, the stronger the projection of the self upon the group. And the stronger, too, the unconscious participations of group members among themselves. So I don't know if you've watched Star Trek, but the Borg in Star Trek is a great example of the one mind hive mentality, that nobody has their own individual thoughts, feelings. There's no individuality, but it's all one group. It also, a great image of that is the soldiers in Nazi Germany, how Hitler arranged all of the soldiers in this kind of square, unified, all walking, goose stepping in the same manner. They all look like one group. We see that in the Star Wars the Star Wars movies, right? All the stormtroopers are in like unified, all looking the same. There's no individuality. So there's a passage I really wanted to read to you guys in Ordinary Men. This is one of the policemen speaking about how things are going with the orders that he was given. He says, "In no case can I remember that anyone was forced to continue participating in executions when he declared that he was no longer able to. As far as group and platoon actions were concerned, here I must honestly admit that with these smaller executions, there were always some comrades who found it easier to shoot Jews than did others, so that the respective commando leaders never had difficulty finding suitable shooters. I must emphasize that from the first days I left, no doubt among my comrades that I disapproved of these measures and never volunteered for them. Thus, on one of the first searches for Jews, one of my comrades clubbed a Jewish woman in my presence, and I hit him in the face. A report was made, and in that way, my attitude became known to my superiors. I was never officially punished, but anyone who knows how the system works knows that outside official punishment, there is the possibility of chicanery, which is like guilt, deceit, that more than makes up for the punishment. So that's interesting. It's not like blatant punishment was inflicted. It's more like chicanery. It was more like guilt. It was more like an enemy of the state. You're going to be frowned upon. And thus I was assigned Sunday duties and special watches. So that I found that to be so fascinating. The collective guilt. Think about that. The collective guilt that once you start to think against the grain, you're going to be an outlier. You're going to be ridiculed. We see that happening all the time. I don't know if you follow Disney and how their political agenda is being played out now, but if you start to question like Gina Carano, I believe is her name. Apologies if I'm saying that incorrectly, but she was fired from Disney Mandalorian because of her political views, because of where she stood. And she got ridiculed and bashed for being an outlier. Or if you go against the grain of diet, for example, you start to eat keto and carnivore, you start to be ridiculed. You start to go down this path, you start to be ridiculed. And I see it happening all the time. If I've seen people being criticized by being so right wing by even just going to the gym. Like gym people are now being associated with far-leaning right-wing people. I'm here thinking that is so preposterous. That is extremely, extremely preposterous. But this is the culture we live in. You start to go against the grain of the collective mind, you're going to get some sort of resistance from culture. But I'd rather that than be a puppet of culture, because culture is definitely not your friend. Eric Neuman goes on to say, only with the progressive systematization of consciousness is there an increase of conscious continuity, a strengthening of the will and the capacity of voluntary action. The stronger his consciousness, the more he can do with it. And the weaker it is, the more things just happen. So open your eyes. Open your eyes. Look into things yourself. Question everything. Question everything. Read and learn. And we have access to YouTube. If you're interested in what people are experiencing on something like a carnivore diet, something so seemingly preposterous from the norm, you have the opportunity to go and learn from those people, to go learn about new studies being performed, go learn about anything you want. Books are so readily available and podcasts are so readily available, to have this open mind rather than this collective unconscious mind. That's what I learned from all of this. I was blown away of all the lies and deceit culture was projecting onto me during, up until my late 20s. And I think that's the best place to stop on this podcast episode. So to be an individual, what one must do is to question everything and to learn from other people who who got to a better place in their life. Because there's a lot of resistance to the great people who have great health. They look good. They look fit. But we want to stay in comfort. Comfort is attractive. But that's not where we should aim ourselves. 100% no. Rise above anxiety, everyone. Let me know what you think of this podcast episode. It was pretty deep. It was dark at some points, but necessary. Necessary. I'll see you on the next podcast episode. Bye for now.
Brad's powerful anxiety recovery program is now available at unpluganxiety.com. The Anxiety Project program is downloadable and puts the power of anxiety recovery in your own hands. Visit unpluganxiety.com